Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from Apocatastasis, an Institute for the Humanities. This recording is a look at Tenebrae. We're going to get into the structure of the prayer, as well as some thematic considerations. Before we move on into our main course, a few words about Apocatastasis. ApocatastasisInstitute is an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. We accept students of about 15 years of age on up, and we have various options for enrollment. We have a full undergraduate course of study where we integrate the disciplines together, which is unique to Apocatastasis. That is to say, when we're talking about ancient Rome, we're reading about China at the same time period, we're studying Latin, we're learning about the philosophy of that time period in different parts of the world. So there's a synchronization of the courses. This is quite unusual. As we remember coming up, we might be in mathematics class 1 hour, then natural science, then gym, then English. And in modern pedagogy, there's a schizophrenia between the topics. There's nothing that ever unites them. Well, we have at least gone to some extent to fix that problem. But we also have all sorts of courses at the college, including in our School of Theology, a presentation, a full college course on the Holy Liturgy, East and West. Professor Rios is out of the saddle for this semester, so I'm carrying those courses, so you're stuck with me for that topic. But we do have a special course on the Holy Liturgy. And finally, for advertising, given the likely demographic of people watching this presentation, we warmly invite you to join the staff and students of ApocatastasisInstitute every day during the school week online as we sing the Divine Office. We sing both elements from the Liturgy of the Hours as well as the Breviarium Romanum. And we do that in the schedule listed on the website here. You can find our great website by looking in the description below. You can find not only our schedule, but the perpetual link that you can access. You certainly do not need to be enrolled in one of our courses to join. This is completely open to every Tom, Dick, and Harry who would like to hop along. And the more the merrier, we say. With those announcements being seen to, we now get on with our main presentation. This talk has 2 parts to it, of which there are plenty of notes. The first part is going to concern the structure of Tenebrae, and we're going to start with some definitions. The second half of this presentation concerns thematic elements within the prayer, which are often overlooked, and that's because they're not obvious. And I would like to point these things out explicitly. Starting with some terminology, let us begin there. So I would like to start with 3 terms. Maybe I'll gin up another 1 or 2 besides. The first 2 terms are related. Those are liturgy and piety. After that, I would like to speak about vigil, the concept of vigil, putting ourselves, of course, within the context of the Triduum of Holy Week and of Lent and Easter. From there, we'll get into, indeed, what Tenebrae is proper, and then we'll move into the structure. All right, so Tenebrae forms part of the Triduum liturgy, and we need to start with that word liturgy. Liturgy, as well as piety, are related in 2 fashions, as I see it. Both of those terms have a different meaning in modern language and usage than they had in days prior, particularly many days prior in a time of history called the classical world or the ancient world. We have to remember that Christianity is a pre-modern religion, and the concepts that we have inherited come from that pre-modern time. And so, frankly, we must use those prior definitions. We need to be wary about taking our modern terminology and thinking that it encompasses the totality of the reality. Liturgy and piety. We would associate in our days liturgy as being an exclusively religious act. And we would truncate piety to being acts of personal devotion. I think I stand on solid ground saying those are the working definitions for most people most of the time these days. Tenebrae is liturgical and it is a work of piety, but we don't mean it in those terms exclusively. The definitions, the modern definitions just given, they are appropriate, but we want to take the classical understanding, the ancient understanding of those terms. So liturgy is actually a term from ancient Greece, and it applies to public works. This would include the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the teacher, the garbage man, the cop, the librarian, the mayor, and so forth. Any work which benefits the community in the classical understanding is liturgical. It is a common term. It is a common work. Some of you who are a little bit older will remember the term utilities. And you understand that the term utility in the 2020s is not the same definition we had back in the 1970s or 1980s. The idea of liturgy could be likened to the former definition of utility. It is a public work, a public action for the benefit of the community. The Holy Church takes this secular understanding of liturgy and applies it to the common worship of the church. Things like civil security, education, various elements of infrastructure are public boons. They are public benefits. However, the most important public activity and the biggest benefit to a society is its adoration of the Blessed Trinity. And this is what liturgy does. So it is fundamentally a common action, and it is for the benefit. It is for primarily the adoration of God, and then for the benefit of the population in toto. And then one can bring private intentions and so forth, but it is a public act, plugging into that ancient definition. Okay, second word is piety. Piety is not simply limited to the modern definition of individual devotion. It is included. The proper classical definition of piety does include individual acts, just like liturgy does include a religious function. But classically, like so many words, it has a much broader meaning. And if we go to ancient texts, such as the Odyssey, and even more appropriately, the Aeneid, where it's a proper theme, piety are spiritual acts which are done, yes, for one's benefit, but more importantly, just like liturgy, for one's own people. In the case of the Aeneid, you'll recall it's Aeneas' family in existence, his family as they live on the earth, and also his future progeny, the Romans. It would also include all the buccaneers whom he was traveling through the Mediterranean with. Now, that's a secular civil story, not to get too deep into the Aeneid, but the point is the definition of piety is a communal work. It is communal worship for the boon of the community past, present, and future. Okay, so those are the definitions of liturgy and piety, and we want to remember that when we're praying Tenebrae or any liturgical action, we want to recall that it is really an act of charity for our fellows, for our community, and so forth. And moving on, our next word, which we want to consider, is vigil. Vigil. You know, I mentioned a class that we teach at Apocatastasis, that of principles of the liturgy, East and West. And if you really want to know what a vigil is, you should check out the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. You can check them out on YouTube, and you can see those people are serious about vigils. They'll have all-night vigils, 16, 17, 20-hour-long vigils before certain feast days. Now, it's more in the temperament of the West for all sorts of reasons to have a more perfunctory understanding of vigil. But this is an old Christian practice, and it finds its scriptural bases in all sorts of vigils kept by the likes of Moses and Christ and so forth. But also, if you think to the parables of Christ, think about the stories of the 10 virgins, the 10 wise virgins, and the wise servant when the master's away. And one of the morals, shall we say, of those parables is keeping vigil. And so the church, even from the earliest centuries, has ritualistically kept that and communally kept that through primarily the office of matins, or as it's presently called, the office of readings. And we'll get into the structure of Tenebrae there, but we do want to have this idea of vigil, that we're keeping up, we're keeping watch. Now, even beyond the ceremonies of Tenebrae, I think we're all familiar with the concept of vigil, especially in connection to Holy Thursday. It's indeed part of the ceremonial to have the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. And so the concept of vigil is one that appears various times. Of course, the vigil of vigils will complete Holy Week and inaugurate the Easter season, that being the Easter Vigil. So vigil is a theme that we have time and again throughout Lent and Holy Week and so forth. And so Tenebrae fits very much within that theme. Okay, so before we hop into things any farther, it's important to not just have our working definitions, of which we now must introduce Tenebrae and a few other words, but I would like to take a pause here and just to be sure that we're on the same page. Again, this is a look at the structure of Tenebrae as we've managed to manifest it through the Liturgia Orarum, the present divine office in the Western Church, the Catholic Church. And then the second part is a look at certain themes. What this is not is scripture commentary. What this is not is rubrical commentary, and what this is not is musical commentary. All of these are most appropriate to an analysis of Tenebrae and the various other ceremonies of Holy Week. However, there are much more qualified people who are able to do commentaries on the Liturgy of the Hours, on the scriptural selections therein, the same rubrically. However, I will point out, if you are interested in the literal nuts and bolts of when do you stand up and sit down and kneel and bow and all that, if you go to our Divine Office website, which I've referenced before, you will see the rubrical notes somewhere here. There we go. Yes, on the oft-requested topic of physical posture in the office. So these are all free downloads. Anyone is welcome to peruse them and snag them for yourself. So if you are interested in that aspect, we can hook you up. However, this is not a rubrical commentary. That's interesting, but it's not what we're doing. And then finally, this is not a musical commentary. If you are interested in that, again, you have very much at your fingertips with the internet. If you want to get into the real nuts and bolts, you can look up the Liber Usuaris and the antiphonal books and so forth. But I'll make a few words a little bit later on that. But these are simply commentaries on the rubrics and on the themes, a few themes. All right. So let us define tenebrae. Tenebrae is the plural nominative of the word tenebra, which means dark. This is to be distinguished from vespera, which is evening or twilight, shadowy. Tenebrae is darkness, and that's one of the features that we're going to see to use to much artistic and spiritual effect in the office of Tenebrae. The office, for a good long stretch during the medieval period into the early modern period, tended to be said in the evening of Holy Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Because of certain changes to fasting disciplines, as well as a focus, a continually growing focus through the 20th century on chronological propriety in the liturgy, that is to say, actually saying morning prayer in the morning, actually saying the Maundy Mass in the evening of Holy Thursday, celebrating the Passion of Christ actually on the afternoon of Friday, actually having the Easter Vigil take place in the middle of the night. Because of that, it became, it is effectively impossible to celebrate Tenebrae on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday because of the more important ceremonies just listed taking that spot, in addition to that larger trend of chronological propriety. Just by the by, some of you may not be aware of this, but for a very long time, probably 700 or 800 years, in the West at least, you would have the chronology completely thrown out during Holy Week. And people would interpret that in very creative ways, such as, when Christ is dead on the cross, therefore everything is just chaos. So, for example, you used to celebrate the Easter Vigil noon on Saturday, on Holy Saturday. Vespers for a very, very long time was said throughout Lent at basically lunchtime because it was a way of honoring the letter of the law, if not the spirit of the law, and so forth. But anyway, that was something that changed in the 20th century. And so when we celebrate Tenebrae, we do it in the morning, preferably the early morning, preferably if you're in the means to do so in the time of the early morning when it's still dark out. And because of that, we want this this overcast aspect, yet one that's mingled with hope. And so we have going from darkness into light. But we focus on the dark because of the heaviness of the latter part of Holy Week. So that's where we get the word tenebrae from. And tenebrae has certain rubrical and environmental interest to it. And so to the environment, the physical environment of the ceremony, the focus is this candelabra, and we refer to this as a hearse. This is the same word we have for a conveyance to the cemetery for dead bodies. And the root meaning is exactly the same. That is to say, a carriage. A hearse, properly speaking, is neither a candelabra nor a wagon for dead people, but rather a carriage. And, well, much like the word casket, which is a jewelry box, has migrated its meaning to refer to a funerary box. Likewise, again, to that theme of words changing over time, it sounds very peculiar to refer to the candelabra of Tenebrae as a hearse, but it means a carriage. And so we have these candles that are held on it, and as the ceremony proceeds, they are extinguished. When the final candle, after all the psalms and readings and such have been seen to, is extinguished, the collect is said and the blessing given, the next and final remarkable aspect of Tenebrae is what's called the strepitus. Strepitus is a Latin word, and it means loud, clattering noise. If you've been down to the subway in the city, perhaps, you will know what a strepitus is, right? You will know when the train goes by what a clatter can be. So that's a strepitus. It's a high volume, cacophonous sound. And when the ceremony of Tenebrae for each day runs its course, you do have this feature, and that is simply the banging on the pews, maybe for 30 seconds by the whole congregation, or banging on the breviaries or missals that people may have, or banging with those books on the pews. And what is the point of that, or what is the symbolism? Well, it's very beautiful. It is that of the earthquake when Christ died. And you had the veil of the temple ripped in two and all of that. That is the liturgical reenactment, let's say, of that remarkable earthquake. So those are some features of Tenebrae right there. And again, we're looking at the combined office of readings and morning prayer that this entails. So the first part, having seen to our immediate definitions, the first part of Tenebrae that we're going to look at is the inviatori. The inviatori is just that. It's an invitation. It is, technically speaking, the first liturgical prayer of each day of the year. In the Western Church, and especially appropriate for Lent, the Psalm 95 is the choice. I'm going to pause briefly here and make the note that I will be referring to the Psalms in what's called the Masoretic numbering. This is the numbering that most Americans are familiar with. And so Psalm 95 is one of the options presently for this, and it's most appropriate for Lent because of the background of Psalm 95 with the Exodus, with the wandering in the desert. Think about the 40 years of the Hebrews in the desert. That's obviously one of the background themes to Lent, in addition to the 40 days of Christ in the desert, of course, and some other usage of the number 40 in the Holy Bible. But anyway, you have the inviatori. You have the inviatori, and whether it's Psalm 95 or one of the other three options, what's remarkable about the inviatori, and we'll see this also with the subsequent hymn, is the ability of the opening elements of Tenebrae to set the theme, of the subsequent offices. Now, that is done in the inviatori by the antiphons. Now, antiphons are something we're going to see throughout the office, and they are these sentences, basically, that bookend each of the psalms or canticles. And they have a remarkable effect of kind of setting a color to each piece, which it wouldn't have nakedly by itself. In the inviatori, the antiphon is interjected between each strophe. Now, it does have thematic reasons, but also I'm reminded of the Regula of Abbot Benedict, St. Benedict of Nursia. And if you read that delightful document, you will find out that Abbot Benedict, who knew so much about human nature, that's why that document is so remarkable and still speaks to people and has many, many thousands of people following it as a rule of life. Abbot Benedict says that the inviatori also should be sung slowly. It should be sung deliberately slowly because of sleepy monks and people who might be late to Tenebrae. So there is a great aspect of human nature to the whole Holy Liturgy, and certainly to Tenebrae. And so there is little speed bumps by the extra antiphons there. Speaking of human nature, it's very normal when saying the office to make mistakes. And I know that many people are new to the office, or they don't say it outside of Tenebrae, or maybe a few times besides that during the year. And often people are conscious, they're self-conscious of making mistakes. And that is actually part of the lesson of the Holy Liturgy, is that people are constantly making little mistakes, little flubs and mispronunciations and so forth. And one should be patient with themselves on that account and patient with others. And there is a lesson even therein. In the Rule of Benedict, of course, the punishment for that is a prostration, but it is the custom, if someone does such a flub, mind wanders, everyone's mind wanders, to do a little mea culpa there and keep it moving. But the point is, no one should be self-conscious at the liturgy. Okay, so moving on from the Inviatori, it begins immediately the hymn, and the hymn also serves that thematic element there, which is actually one of the reasons it was moved up in the Liturgy of the Hours. If you're familiar with the earlier offices in the Roman Rite, you know that the hymn, at least at Lauds and Vespers, it actually follows the canticle. It follows the gospel canticle. So it's much later. So it's moved up because it does have the potency of having that theme there. Okay. And we're going to look at one of the hymns that the church gives us for that a little bit later. Again, when it comes to singing, here's the Liber once again, which is the church's chant in it. When it comes to singing, there is a benefit, if you have the time and the interest, to get into the chant, because what the music allows one to do, beyond just the recto tono singing of it, but the actual chant notation, is the people who've set the different psalms and such to different tones. What they're able to do is cast an emotion over the psalms. And if you do get into the Liber with Tenebrae, you can see there are certain very Semitic tones to it, especially for the canticles of Jeremiah. And the mournful aspect, maybe we think of Psalm 51, or the prayer that we'll get from Habakkuk, from the prophet Isaiah. These are highlighted, their sentiments, their emotions are highlighted by the chant notation. So just a little note there. All right, so following that, in Tenebrae, for each of the 3 days, you have what are called nocturnes. Now, these comments are referring to a packet which myself and others have spent several years producing, and typesetting and so forth. And what we did to produce these nocturnes. Nocturnes in the traditional Roman Rite are 3 psalms and 3 readings. There are, technically speaking, no nocturnes in the present Roman Rite. However, we have taken advantages of different indulgences, different permissions that the Vatican has given. I'm not going to belabor the nitty-gritty, but in a nutshell, when the Liturgy of the Hours was released, it met a need which a lot of people had been talking about for a long time, and that is a reduction in the onus, or the burden, of the office, especially for those with the care of souls, to use the old language, those involved in the active ministry. It is one of the features of the Western Catholic Church to monasticize. There's a lot of practices in the Western Church that start in monasteries and then they get diffused throughout the population. The most famous of that would probably be the Holy Rosary, which is a Dominican devotion that is spread amongst the people in time. Another example would be Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, again, a monastic practice which gets popularized. Another very late addition, actually, would be calling secular priests, parish priests, father. That is a monastic practice that gets popularized. And likewise, with the divine office, the relatively heavy onus or burden of the office, which is something that's more realistic for monks, was something that got spread because of the mendicant movement, for instance, during the medieval period and certainly after the Tridentine period. By the 20th century, there were different surveys that were put out prior to the council, and one of the consistent requests was to, let's say, reduce the quantity of prayer in hopes of lifting the quality of prayer, and that it is not altogether realistic to expect a secular priest to have the same prayer routine as a man in the monastery. And so you have the Liturgy of the Hours, which is the product of that. Long story short, I'm getting back to those nocturnes. Long story short, a lot of religious houses in the 1970s and 1980s petitioned Rome and complained that whilst they had met the need of a good amount of the clerics, especially those in the world, which is probably most clerics, now the monasteries felt high and dry because the office was too short for them. And so the Vatican gave this permission to do two things, which we have taken advantage of and has allowed us to replicate rather closely the old system of nocturnes. So you need to know this in order to understand when I'm referring to nocturnes in a few moments. And that is the permission to use the Psalms from the 2 weeks back. The schema of the Psalms, as you know, in the Catholic Church presently, is over 4 weeks. And so the permission was that religious houses could use let's say it's week 1. You could also use, before the second reading, the Psalms from week 2. So you would say the Psalms for week 1, the ones appointed for the day, and the first reading. And then you would go and snag those from 2 weeks hence and then say the second reading. So you're padding out the office. And then also for higher feast days, which we've used for now the Tenebrae here, there were many canticles that were suggested with a New Testament gospel reading. The point is, we have replicated over these years this system, and it is very close to the former proper nocturnes that we saw in the days of the Breviarium Romanum. That is to say, 3 psalms or canticles, a reading, 3 more, a reading, 3 more, a reading. All right. And the psalms for the 3 days are, of course, appropriate to the immediate mysteries in the life of Christ. And also, you'll notice the overlapping, just like with Psalm 95 and the Inviatori, to the history, the ancient history of the Hebrews, especially that concerning Exodus and the wandering in the desert. These are bigger themes we can return to in the second half of this presentation. Okay. Once that runs its course, Inviatori, hymn, and 3 sets of nocturnes and readings, morning prayer immediately begins. And that consists, as it is the case for every day during the year, with a psalm appropriate to a new day. That could be a literal reference to the morning, or a new beginning, repentance. Then there is an Old Testament canticle, and then there is a psalm of praise, or as we say in Latin, lauds. That model is the same for every single day of the year. Now, of course, they're also going to be appropriate to the mysteries of the Triduum for Tenebrae. I just would like to focus for a moment on the Old Testament reading, the Old Testament canticle, which is sandwiched between the 2 psalms. If you're not familiar with the daily rhythm of the office, you're not going to understand a certain symbolism. And that is that during evening prayer or vespers, the model that we see in morning prayer, the structure is very similar. But we see that there's a New Testament canticle and it's moved to the last place. So in morning prayer, which we're going to see in Tenebrae, you have a psalm an Old Testament canticle and another psalm. In Vespers, you have two psalms and then a New Testament canticle. And there's a symbolism there that's very much appropriate to Tenebrae. And that is the passing of the people of God from the Hebrews and the works of the law to the New Testament Israel, the church, and the works of grace. Some of you might be familiar with the previous usage of the Mass, the so-called Latin Mass. And there was a very similar notice of that reality when the acolyte would take the missal from the epistle side of the altar and then move it to the farther end, or the gospel side of the altar. Like we saw with that, so with the change between morning prayer and evening prayer, between the Old Testament canticle and the New Testament canticle, that is to say, the moving of the covenant from one group of people based on the Mosaic Code to the world based on grace. Okay, so we have that, and in the second half, we'll get into one of the themes there. I'd like to look at Habakkuk and Habakkuk's prayer, as well as that of Hezekiah, a lot of H's that we'll get into. Okay, so you have the three Psalms laid out. Now, you then have a capitulum, or a short reading. This is appropriate to the mystery of the day. And then after that, there's the option for a sermon. And depending on the day and the clergy we might have at hand, that will be given or not. It's not a necessary element. It's an ad libidinum. It's a freely possible element at will, let's say. By the by, this is one of a few areas, actually, where the Liturgy of the Hours took a cue from the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, actually. In addition to the more extensive Psalter, we can see influence in the possibility of a sermon at the office as well. So you have that, and then you get into the responsorials. Now, the responsorials are something we see both in the first part of Tenebrae and after the short reading. The responsorials are things I have a feeling a lot of us pass over without giving much thought to. And we rob ourselves doing that. The responsorials, whether those are we have a term for that, we call that trophiae. Trophiae, that's where we get our English word trope or theme, right? If you have a trope in a movie or a book, it's a certain theme that's running throughout. The trophiae, the responsorials, after the readings at the Office of Readings, as well after the reading in morning prayer, that is the church's official response to the reading. And the lesson there, it's very profound. It's this idea that the Word of God is not to be this inert thing, but must have this dialogical reply. And we see that, getting back to the initial comments, on the liturgy being a communal thing, and not just communal in the horizontal way, but also communal in the vertical way, with God primarily, but with the saints and angels as well. And so make sure to pay special attention to those responsorials, to those trophiae, as we say. When it comes to the responsori, after the short reading in morning prayer for each day, notice something, and that is the removal of the traditional responsorial format, which we'll have known for every single day for the rest of the year, and it's replaced with the selection from Philippians chapter 2, talking of Christ was obedient. He was obedient even to death, death on a cross. And as the 3 days of the Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday progress, that verse from Philippians chapter 2 is revealed. So just like you have the revelation of the cross on Good Friday, you also have very much connected to that verse that Christ was obedient on Thursday. Christ was obedient to death, on Good Friday to death on a cross, and then on Holy Saturday, all of that, and therefore God highly exalted him. So it's a very beautiful aspect of the Tenebrae services to have the responsorials in general, and especially Philippians chapter 2. After that, we get into the climax of Tenebrae for each day, and that's the climax of morning prayer, which is the Benedictus, the prayer of Zechariah, when his speech is restored. And this forms the pinnacle of the office. It basically takes the place of it is equivalent as a climax to the consecration in the Holy Mass, right? It is the high point of the ceremony. And so where that's really set is the antiphons. The antiphons at the canticle are especially important. And after that, we get into the preces, or the intercessions, which is really hitting home this idea that this is liturgical prayer. It is communal prayer for the whole world, primarily for God's honor, but after that, for the salvation of the whole world. Following that, there is the Pater Noster, the Our Father. It is one of 3 times that the Church says the Our Father each day formally, the other being Holy Mass, and the final being at evening prayer. And this is a practice that goes back all the way to the 2nd century. And there is textual evidence of this in the Didache and in other ancient documents as well. This is a very ancient practice to say the Our Father 3 times. And so following the preces, the intercessions, the Our Father is said. Then there is the collect appropriate to the day, the dismissal, and then the strepitus, which I referenced earlier, a great dramatic element. We rob ourselves of the profundity of the ceremony and the vigil nature if we don't leave quietly. It's very important after the ceremonies for each day run their course to leave the building quietly. I'll not give you my Elmer Fudd impression, but be very, very quiet. And try to bite your tongue and to avoid the chit-chat as best you can, and keep that somber atmosphere to it. This concludes the first part of this presentation. In part 2, I want to look at certain thematic elements, just things that stand out to myself, and things I believe are easy to overlook in the beautiful ceremonies of Tenebrae. Hi everyone, John Coleman quickly here in the middle of this presentation to invite you to go over to ApocatastasisInstitute.wordpress.com. And while there, in the drop-down of About the School, you can find out all about just that, the classes we offer, information about enrollment and matriculation, our schools of theology, arts, and sciences, as well as our campus and staff and testimonials, in addition to related materials. We accept students of about 16 years of age and up and teach at the undergraduate level. And with that, back to the show. Okay, so we're back now with part 2, where we look at certain themes in Tenebrae, in the choice of hymns, of readings, and certain things we need to keep an eye out for, because they're easy to speedboat over. The first thing I'd like to point out is the mandate to use the Pange Lingua on the Triduum. I happen to have in my hands something close to a unicorn, which is the 1973 Latin version of the Liturgy of the Hours. They are not a dime a dozen. In fact, this might be a galley, might be a proof text from when they ran the thing out the first time. In any case, here we are. And this is, if you're interested and have the training, one of the benefits of knowing a bit about Latin and being able to read this, because we have in the 73 edition, as well as the 2002 edition of the Liturgia Orarum in Latin, we have the actual hymns of the church in there. What we have in the English edition are substitute hymns. I'm not knocking them or critiquing them in any fashion at all, But in terms of liturgical principles, this might come as a surprise, but the home for hymns is not the Holy Mass. It is not the natural environment for hymns. Rather, it is the divine office. And in the Editio Typica in Latin, we actually have the hymns appointed for the various hours, which we lose in the English translation. Which is not to say that there aren't cool features in the English translation. I'll give a shout out to the Psalm prayers and to the appendix on poetry at the very end of the American edition. So I'm very appreciative of that as well. So that's actually another theme within the Holy Liturgy, is that there is no single book or single edition which encompasses everything. And I think we need to take that in the same tone of voice that I mentioned when we make mistakes in the liturgy. There is a very humanizing aspect to these realizations. But getting to the hymn, the Pange Lingua, there's such depth to the Holy Liturgy. And we all know the tune, right? Pange lingua gloriosi, etc., etc. There are various versions of this hymn. I don't recall right now whether the version appointed for the Holy Week is that of Prudentius or Thomas of Aquin, Thomas Aquinas. Those are the two most famous versions. If I had to pull the trigger, I would say that it's from Prudentius, because Aquinas features very, very prominently in a concomitant feast, if you want a mouthful, a concomitant feast. This is a practice in the Catholic Church of having a sister feast, sometimes within the octave or sometimes later in the year, where maybe it would be inappropriate to have an overlapping theme, so to speak, for the day. For example, on the octave day of St. Mary Magdalene, you have St. Martha. Immediately before, I think, St. Augustine's Day, you have St. Monica. And if it's not before, it's after, but they're right next to each other. Right, concomitant feast. It used to be the practice in the Western Church to never mention liturgically Peter without mentioning Paul, or Paul without mentioning Peter. Concomitant aspect, where there are these separate foci, but they're close enough that they have a relationship. Anyhow, the concomitant feast, of course, of Holy Thursday, which you already have the Chrism Mass, you have the suffering in the garden, you have the institution of the priesthood, which is the fundamental focus of Holy Thursday. You also have the institution of the Eucharist. And so the concomitant feast for Holy Thursday is Corpus Christi later on in the year. You can also see Trinity and Sacred Heart as being, very, very related to Holy Week, but it's not entirely appropriate. You just overload it. You'd overload the theme. So you put them immediately after the Pentecost holiday. So in any case, Aquinas wrote most of the Corpus Christi office, and I know he's featured more prominently here. Therefore, I'm assuming the Pange Lingua that we have for Holy Thursday is that of Prudentius, the 4th century, 5th century Christian poet. It doesn't really matter. That's more of an academical question. But what matters for context here, getting back to the Triduum, getting back to Tenebrae, is the tune. Da ta 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 ta. That tune is not originally a liturgical tune. That tune is one of Caesar's route marches. It was one of the hymns, so to speak, that Caesar's troops would sing as they were slaughtering Gauls and teaching Vercingetorix what was up. That is to say, the tune for the Pange Lingua was a tune of triumph, of military triumph over an enemy. And for this, I need to spend a few minutes. Again, the Christian liturgy is a pre-modern product. It is a pre-modern baby, and we need to understand those themes. We're going to get to some Semitic themes that we have in Tenebrae momentarily, but there is also the aspect of the imperium, of the Roman influence on the liturgy. And so you have a civil victory march that's being used to refer to Christ's victory over the devil. And that's not just the Holy Church in its liturgy doing this. We find similar references to Roman victory practices applied to Christ. Even the term Christ from the Greek, the Christos, actually has a civil meaning of kind of like a five-star general. And that's the closest analog they had to Messiah word from the Hebrew. Anyway, Rome, ancient Rome, of which in many ways the liturgy is a direct connect. And that's a topic that's beyond our immediate time here, but I would like to focus on this. In ancient Rome, you had three ways you could honor a victor. Again, the church is using the idea of a victorious civil general and applying it to Christ in the Pange Lingua tune. The minor victory over like a neighboring city would result in the general being given a lamb, a sheep, an ovus, and they would bring the sheep and slaughter it at the temple of Mars. And it is from this little honor that we get the word ovation, right? I give you a standing ovation. An ovation was the lowest level of honor that the Senate could give. After that, we have the famous triumph. And now this is something that St. Paul explicitly makes allusion to in Corinthians. I believe it's 1 Corinthians chapter 9, but it's in one of those two epistles in any case, where he speaks about Christ. He speaks about the souls saved by Christ being led in triumph. Elsewhere, appropriate, especially the Pange Lingua, right? We have this idea of despoiling. Christ despoils the devil. We'll get to that in a second. But the triumph imagery, the Pange Lingua would have been that tune, not the Christian lyrics, but the tune would have been one that we would see in the Roman civil triumphs that the church uses to talk about Christ's ultimate triumph over the ultimate enemy. The middle one was the triumph. So you would have this long parade. You would initially begin it with all the booty. You'd have a big parade. Think like the World War I, World War II parades in New York City, right? The ticker tape parades, right? You would begin it with, you would have wagons and wagons and wagons of all the booty that you'd stolen from the guy you had conquered. Just wagons of all his trinkets and whatever. And it's that reference that Paul is speaking of, right? That Christ saves all these souls from hell, and he steals them from the devil. He conquers them from the devil. Beautiful, beautiful imagery. But in the triumph, then you would have, the captive, defeated army. Then you'd have the captive chieftain in a dog kennel, basically, and then basically be killed at the end of the triumph. Then you would have the victorious army marching. And this is also used in various biblical things, like in the book of Apocalypse, marching with laurels, like victors, without weapons. The Senate was always worried about armed soldiers in Rome. But then you had, the victorious soldiers who were feted, right? They did not have weapons, but they had laurels of victors, and people would cheer them and hoot and holler. You'd have music and so forth. And then finally, you would have the victorious general with his face all done up in red like Mars. And then they would go and make a pass past the Senate and then go to the temple of Mars. The point of this interesting ceremony, of course, is this idea of it's no doubt at a triumph. Who has won? Who has conquered? And the church again uses that to apply this to Christ, the ultimate victorious general. And so how do we have that? Because we have the Pange Lingua. We have a triumphant tune, dun 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 dun, etc. Beautiful. This is the profundity of the Holy Liturgy. All right. Moving along here, it's well beyond our time together, but it deserves mention, to talk about the overlapping of the Mosaic Exodus, the Exodus from Egypt, as well as the life of David, especially during the different revolts that he had to put up with. The church uses a lot of these incidents and applies them to that of Christ. Now, we're moving to the discussion of the book of Hebrews. And so there's a great sublimation in the selections of texts in the Office of Readings throughout Lent. For the guts of Lent, up until Gaudete Sunday, basically, you have readings from Exodus and Deuteronomy speaking about the exodus of Moses and the children of Israel out of Egypt. The church uses this and applies it to Christ, and not just in later years, but of course we remember Luke chapter 18, 18, at the Mount Tabor, at the Transfiguration. What is the verb that Luke uses to describe what Christ will do in Jerusalem during the mystery, during the Paschal mystery? It is Exodus. Moses and Elijah spoke to Christ of the exodus he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. One cannot understand in its profundity Holy Week, the Paschal mystery, the Triduum, Tenebrae. One cannot understand it except to realize that the church is constantly making parallels to the Old Testament Exodus. Christ's exodus on the cross needs to be understood as building upon the Mosaic Exodus. After all, right? I mean, literally, even historically, Christ's own events are overlaid literally on the Passover ceremonies. Right. So don't forget, these are not mistakes. These are not mistakes. And also, through and through, the church draws us to the life of David as well, and the various tribulations he had and his sorrows. A good mention as well, a third place mention, is the prophet Jeremiah and the destruction of the temple and various of the canticles, of course, concern that shock that the prophet had. And the church applies the tribulation in the desert, that of King David, that of conquered Jerusalem, of course, applies that all together in the ultimate tragedy and triumph of the Paschal mystery to Christ himself, but making these historical thematic allusions to prior times and places, persons, and things. So all of that is to say we go from Exodus and Deuteronomy in our readings to, during Tenebrae, as we had been for a few days before, looking at the book of Hebrews. Now, we want to put that even in the larger scope. Now, formerly in the Roman Rite, you had this period which was called Septuagesima. And there's the practice in Septuagesima, the 3 weeks prior to Ash Wednesday, of reading the story of Adam, the story of Noah, and the story of Abraham. That would have led into the story of Moses for most of Lent, which is actually not just maintained in the present books, but actually is restored. And then that would have led into a discussion of Joshua crossing the Jordan and whatnot. Now, some of that prior reading of Genesis is still maintained in the Missal, but it's not maintained in the office. That's just a parenthetical note of simply to say that The church in its readings, whether formerly or presently, puts the context of Christ now, not just in that of the context of Moses and David, but also in that of Adam, Noah, Abraham, bringing us into Moses, and then all of that setting up to what are our readings for Tenebrae? Hebrews. So after you go, because you used to formerly, like I say, have a discussion of Joshua, but that is not the case. Now you go from the discussion of the tabernacle and the wilderness tabernacle at the end of Deuteronomy and Exodus, and then you get into Hebrews. The church gives us Hebrews because you can't understand Hebrews without understanding the Mosaic wilderness tabernacle. So pay attention to that. Again, this isn't a scripture study, so we don't need to concern ourselves with the nitty-gritty of that, but do be aware. Then we have, I bring our attention to Isaiah chapter 38. Once I said, in the noontime of life, I must depart. This is the prayer of Hezekiah. He was on the gates of death, as he tells us indeed in the Psalm, and a prophet and patriarch Isaiah prays for him, makes intercession for him, and he is healed and restored to life. And so the church uses this example from Hezekiah and applies it to the individual sinner, lost humanity, however you like, redeemed now by Christ. So just notice the sublimation of themes, and like any aspect in all of these, the context will reward the study you give it. These are just a few points that I'm bringing up, but there's so much to get into. I thought it worthwhile to bring up Isaiah 38 once I said in the new time of life. Then finally, I would like to bring up what I think is one of the real gems of Tenebrae, one of the real gems of Christian interpretation, reinterpretation of the Hebrew texts. And before I do that, I return to my triumph here. A little hangnail that I neglected to point out. There was a higher honor that the Roman Senate could give beyond the triumph. The little honor was the ovation. The big triumph was the triumph, and the big honor was the triumph. But the highest honor, and this is also used extensively in Christian liturgy, in scripture, and indeed, actually, more than a hangnail, because it is appropriate to Psalm 24, which is what I'm building up to, is the highest honor the Senate could vote, and that was the spolia optima, the highest spoils. This was rewarded to a general who killed an enemy general in single man-to-man combat. This only happened twice in Roman history. Once in the Regnal period, in that period where Rome was dominated by Carthage, a time of great mythology, and that doesn't mean it's made up, but a time of great elaboration in the storytelling to draw out the spiritual realities, let's say. Mythologies are not necessarily made up in the way that we use that word. And then, the other example, more concrete in the way we understand history now, was during the Second Punic War. There was a Roman general up in Gaul who killed a Gallic chieftain in hand-to-hand combat. And just like we see in the Iliad as well as the Aeneid, what you do once you kill your enemy is you strip him naked and you put on your armor and you leave his sorry hide on the ground and you're strutting off the battlefield in your enemy's armor. Just like the triumph, there is no doubt who just won that contest. The church uses that and applies it to Christ's confrontation with the devil, that it is a total obliteration of the powers of hell and of the chieftain of hell. So that indeed brings us to Psalm 24. I have on the screen here a very peculiar early modern painting, very, very peculiar, by a very peculiar man called Hieronymus Bosch. And this is his painting Yes, of hell, but it's actually focusing on the theme of Holy Thursday. And that is, using the Old English, the harrowing of hell. To harrow something is to, scoop it all up and to strip it and to to gather it up. Maybe we could say we harrow a field at harvest time. And so the harrowing of hell is the predominant theme for Holy Saturday. It is a time of tremendous expectation. Holy Saturday in the Liturgy of the Hours has one of the most profound readings, in my opinion, of the entire year. Of course, for Holy Thursday, we have St. Mellitus of Sardis. For Good Friday, we have St. John Chrysostom. And then we have the anonymous author for Holy Saturday. All we know from him is that he's from the 2nd century. We'll get plenty of the Western Fathers as we did during Easter time, but it's interesting the Church brings us to some of the Eastern authors with St. Mellitus and St. John. But concerning the Holy Saturday reading, very beautiful, talking about the harrowing of hell. It's one of the, in my opinion, one of the real pinnacles of the Western Rite is the present Liturgy of the Hours for that day. Very beautiful. And here we have Hieronymus Bosch in his own unique way portraying that. This looks like, because it is a very chaotic scene, but appropriate to this, who's that guy there? Who's the fellow there busting down the gate? That's Christ, right? This is Holy Saturday, where Christ is going down into limbo and reaving, snatching up all the souls of the righteous who could not go to heaven until the Paschal mystery, until Calvary, let's say. And so we have this great example, and of course we're reminded of is it Matthew 18? The gates of hell will not prevail. A lot of people don't quite understand who's on the offense and who's on the defense in that verse, the gates of hell shall not prevail. A lot of people kind of envision the church being in the static position, the defensive, and look, hell won't be able to conquer the church. Actually, gates don't attack anything. That's actually speaking of the offensive action of Christ and the church on hell. And that's what Hieronymus Bosch gets in this painting. It is hell that's under attack, and hell whose defenses will not be able to hold out against the offensive church on the march. So anyway, we have an example of the gates of hell not being able to hold off Christ coming to redeem and coming to snatch up Abraham and Moses and Adam and Eve and this whole lot. In fact, in the reading for Holy Saturday, we have a beautiful imagined dialogue between Christ and Adam. That brings us to the final point of this that I wanted to thematically bring up, and that is Psalm 24. Please read a commentary on that by yourself. There's so much in this that's so appropriate to Holy Saturday as we've been building up through Holy Thursday and Good Friday. So I just want to read 2 paragraphs from this article and we'll be through. So in Psalm 24, as Yahweh's assault upon the gate. So this is referring, they're putting the Psalm 24 in its Semitic context, and then they're going to put it in its Christian context. As Yahweh's assault upon the gates of Baal's palace in the underworld begins, it begins with these words of Baal being used against him in mockery. These words, which the devil claims he spoke as he began his rebellion, are now thrown back in his face, the devil's face, as Yahweh comes to take from him even that little power, that of death, which remains to him in the rescue of his righteous ones. What people don't get in Psalm 24 is that Psalm 24 is a triumphant mockery of the Phoenician god Baal, one of the significant pagan deities that you'll be familiar with from your Old Testament reading. If you don't understand that there was a pre-existing hymn to Baal, you're not going to get the joke or the mockery of Baal and the devil that Psalm 24 is, and why the church uses that in its Holy Saturday liturgy. Yahweh strong and mighty, Yahweh mighty in battle, Yahweh of military hosts has come to bring salvation to his righteous ones, to destroy the gates of Baal's palace and take them to dwell with him on his holy mountain assembly. Christianity has always seen the assault envisioned by Psalm 24 as having taken place in the death and resurrection of Christ. Among many of the fathers, it is seen as the very reason for the incarnation. The Son of God become man so that he could die. This is what we have in the Creed, right? He was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered and died. You immediately jump from the birth to the death of Christ. It's another way of saying what we just read here. He died so that he could be swallowed up by death, as was Jonah, and emerge victorious with the righteous dead from the whole human race. The harrowing of Hades is described in Scripture, Matthew 12, as well as Mark 3, and it is depicted in iconography. It is a constant theme of hymnography of the resurrection. Most importantly, however, it is ritually enacted and participated in by the Christian faithful in the rush service of Pascha. This is on an Eastern website here, but that's for us in the West. That's going to be your Holy Saturday, right? That's your Holy Saturday at Tenebrae. You have your Psalm 24. Just as the Jewish Passover celebration served as a ritual to bring the future generations into the event of the Exodus, so also this ritual of Christian Passover brings each generation of Christians through the experience of Yahweh, Christ our God's raid, military term, on the devil's palace in Hades. Okay, and it goes on there. I really encourage you to dig into the different commentaries on all the Psalms, especially Psalm 24 is what I want to highlight in this introduction. So there we have it. There's much, much more that we can go on with, but I think I've chewed your ear off enough. Finally, thank you for your attention, and do join us for the Divine Office online at Apocatastasis, and you can find out all about that in the link down below. With that being seen, too, I wish you well, and take care now. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that presentation brought to you by ApocatastasisInstitute. If you would like to assist our work, you may do so by going to ApocatastasisInstitute.wordpress.com/contact, and you can access our donations website, rhetoricanova.xyz. You can find that down below in the description. See you next time.